Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and welcome back to this video series on learning JavaScript for digital tabletop game and web development. In the previous video, we built a simple dice roller, and in this video, we're going to do a little bit of exploration of objects and arrays because we'll need to know at least some of the basic concepts surrounding them before we get into actual tabletop game development and web development and digitizing our games. It's kind of like you got to eat your broccoli before you eat your dessert. We need to understand at least some basic concepts about these two different types of data types before we get started. So objects and arrays, actually let's start with arrays first. Arrays are a different type of data type, a different type of data that JavaScript uses. And I'm just going to go ahead and delete this code. You can obviously save it elsewhere if you want to use it and reuse your dice roller and simulator. And way back in an earlier video, we talked about these data types of saying, if we say let x equal, what do we say? Hello world. This is a string, and I can comment it as a string. Let y equal 5. This is an integer. And we said let z equal true. This is a Boolean. These are three different data types within JavaScript. Another data type is called, what do we call this? Let a equals, and then these brackets. This is called an array. An array is a data type that allows us to store information in between these two brackets. In fact, and they're comma separated values in general. So in fact, let's say we have a card game and we want to create a simple deck that has things in it. And each of these variables, let's say they're a card. So let's switch our X, Y, and Z to card 1, card 2, and card 3. When we store this array as a variable called A, we can just store like an empty array the way that we have it here, or we could say let A equal card 1, comma, card 2, and card 3. And I'm going to say console.log A. Now, when I run my script by saying node log.js, it demonstrates that I have an array that has hello world, 5, and true in it. Those are my three cards. And you'll also notice that I have three different data types in that array. I have a string, I have an integer, and I have a Boolean, which is cool. That doesn't really make sense for a card game. So we could just say, let's just give these names. Let's call card 1 a fighter, card 2 will be rogue, and card 3 will be wizard. And we don't need these comments anymore because they're not true. Well, the string one is true. And now when let me just for parity's sake, I will call this array instead of A. Console log array. And when I log to the console of the array, I see fighter, rogue, and wizard. That's pretty cool. If I wanted to store a bunch of values like this, then an array is a good way of doing that. But you might be thinking, well, how do I access like the fighter and not the wizard or the rogue or whatever? Well, I'd like for you to pay attention to the way that we access what are called the indexes of an array. And an index is the position of an item within the array. So you might be thinking fighter is 1, rogue is 2, and wizard is 3. That's not how it works in many different programming languages. In fact, the first index, the first number here is 0. So fighter is equal to 0, rogue is equal to 1, and wizard is equal to 2. That might throw you for a loop when you're beginning to learn about computer programming, but you get used to it after a while, and you remember that actually the first index is going to be 0. So if I want to find the first index, what I can say is console.log array, and then I put the little brackets right next to it, just as I did to declare the array, and I can say 0. Delete the previous line, and just say console log array bracket 0. Save it, run it, and I see that's fighter. It just throws that up on the screen for me. And if I say after that console.log array, where am I? 1, and console.log array 2, then I see fighter, rogue, and wizard, and I'm able to see the different elements within my array by using this index notation. There are several other things that we can do with arrays that are beyond the scope of this video, but we will get into them the further that we get into our programming journey. There are, for example, we could say let x equal array dot pop console.log x, and we see an extra representation of wizard. Well, let's see how that works. Let's instead, after we do this pop function, console.log array, we see that we start off with listing fighter, rogue, and wizard, and then we see wizard, and then we see after we log to the console or array, we only see fighter and rogue. Well, array.pop is a built-in function. If I hover over it, it's a built-in function with JavaScript that removes the last element from an array and returns it. It just means that we've popped it popped the last thing off of our array, and we're returning it to the to be stored in the variable that is x. If we said let y equal array.shift, and instead of console logging these individual elements, let's just log the whole array so that we can see everything together. I misspelled array. It's not going to help us. Okay, once again. So I log to the console the entire array, which is fighter, rogue, and wizard. Then I log to the console x, which is wizard, which is the last thing on the list, and I end up with rogue. That just might look a little confusing because I haven't logged to the console y as well. Okay, once again, we start off with logging to the console the entire array, then we pop off of the end of the array one of the last value and store it in x, and we shift from the front of the array, which is just JavaScript's built-in function for removing the first element from an array and returning it, and then we log to the console x and y, and then show what array is at the end of all of those operations. And we start off with fighter, rogue, and wizard. We pop off wizard, we shift off fighter, and we're left with rogue. It's not super important that you're like, experts in these operations right now. I just kind of want you to get exposed to them so that you're familiar with some of the things that you can do with arrays, and that might be a good homework assignment, is just to look up JavaScript arrays and see some of the operations that you can perform on them using built-in JavaScript functions. For example, if we log to the console what the array looks like after each operation, so we say log to the console the array, pop off the last one, store it in x, log to the console the array again. Then shift off the first thing and log it to the console. Then tell us what the array is again. And then let's say we have let card4 equal, what's another one? Cleric. And we haven't added it to our array. Well, let's do that at the end and say array.push card4 and then console.log array. Push, if we hover over it, will tell us appends new elements to an array, returns the length of the array. You could say, so we type in node log.js and we see our first reference is the first thing that's printed to the screen is the entire array at the beginning of the code. And it has fighter, rogue, and wizard are 3 cards in it. Doesn't have the 4th card, which we haven't added it yet. We pop off the wizard. Then we log to the console what the array looks like now, and it just says fighter and rogue. Then we shift off the fighter, and so it just has rogue. Then we push cleric into the array, which appends it at the end of the array, and we log to the console the array again, and it says rogue and cleric. So we have 2 cards in it. So like if you're dealing cards, for example, and we could, for example, use the randomizer that we used in the previous video, the dice roller, to determine a random number and generate cards from it or pull cards from the deck. And then we have these cards represented neatly within this array that we can now deal from the end of the deck or the top of the deck or however we want to manipulate them. We don't quite have all of the tools necessary right now to do all of those things, but the general concept for how to do them is within these arrays. The other thing, which I'd love for you to do some research on as your homework, is to look up JavaScript objects. I'm going to delete this. These console logs here to give us some space. And let's say let obj obj equals curly braces, kind of like we do when we have our functions and we have code blocks in between these curly braces. An object is another data type that allows us to store key value pairs and is a great way of storing information that we want to reference later or to use to manipulate in some way. And I find them really useful in conceptualizing things like character classes, for example. That's the way that we're going to look at it here. I can just initialize an empty object here, or I can put things in between them. You'll recall that when I have things between curly braces, I'm going to indent to make everything look clean and work nice. And I could say, in fact, let's delete these cards here and delete our array. Let's just delete everything. And let's say within the object, I'll say card1 fighter card2 rogue card3 wizard. So just a note on syntax. When you're writing an object, there's a few things to take note of. One is that on each new line, I have a new key value pair. The thing on the left is called a key, and the thing on the right is called a value. What's on the left-hand side is rather than following it with an equals, I'm going to follow it with a colon like this. And then at the end of my line, I need to have a comma rather than a semicolon. There's some reasons for this, but just generally keep in mind that within an object, you need to have a semicolon and a comma, whereas we might be used to having a an equal sign and a semicolon. And at the very end, the last value in my object, I don't have a comma after it. That's just the syntax that you have to follow in JavaScript. Now, when I console.log my object, I see within the curly braces, it shows me the key value pairs separated by commas. A little bit similar to my array, a little bit different, because my array just has really one key to think about. It's the index, whether it starts at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, and then the value that is at that index. Here, I'm able to assign my own keys, which is going to be useful in ways that we'll see in just a moment. Let's say instead of cards, I have different elements. Similar to how we had different data types within our array, I might have different elements here within my object. Different types of data within my object. Let's call this object class data. And each of my classes has a name. It has hit points. And it has, let's say, if it's a magic user, if it's able to use magic, it's magical. And this class data, let's start with the name of this class is wizard. Its hit points start at 10, and it's true. If it's magical, that means it's true. That means that it's I have a string, I have an integer, and I have a Boolean that are stored within my class data. If I log to the console this object, I'm going to get a similar, oops, I need to change the name of my object here, class data. If I log it to the console, I see a similar object here. It says the name is wizard, it has 10 hit points, and it is a magical type of class. I might want to access specific parts of this class data. I might want to say, like, I just want to know what the class data's name is. So similar to how we used the, we did this class data 0 within brackets for our array. With our object, we can say class data dot name console dot log class data dot hp and console dot log class data dot magical. When I log those to the console, I see wizard, 10, and true. So it is that's this what's called dot notation gives me the ability to access these specific keys within the within my object and display the values associated with those keys. I could just as easily use bracket notation like we did with our array, and instead of using dot notation, I can put brackets around each one of these. And I also need the quotation marks because I've defined these keys with my own names here. So I've got class data bracket name HP and magical. Save it, run my code, and I get the same numbers here, or the same values here, wizard, 10, and true. Just a different way of doing the same thing, although there are different usages between dot notation and bracket notation that we don't need to cover right now. Just want you to be exposed to them before we get into applications of them. I could also define some of these things later, like I could say, instead of logging to console, I could say class data dot what's something else we would want to do. let's call it damage, like how much damage they do. And we could say, let's just say 5. And then console.log class data. After we've done that, run it, and we see that it's actually appended at the end of our object a new key value pair where class data.damage is equal to 5. So that's another way, like if you at some point need to add something to an object, you can do it after you've declared it. It doesn't have to be while you're declaring the object. One small thing as well that you might see in what's called object-oriented programming, which it would be a really useful use of your time to just Google functional versus object-oriented programming or different paradigms of programming and read that up. Read up on that, as we'll be doing some object-oriented stuff throughout our coding journey. There is a thing in JavaScript called classes, where you're able to almost, sometimes you can think of it as like a factory where you can use a template of a class, which is different from a class that you'd see in a role-playing game. They're called classes in JavaScript and other programming languages. You can create a factory where you can provide that factory with information, and out will come objects that will be different based on the particular object, but will have a parent class with which they will all share some similarities. Here's an example of what how we might use a class. So we've called this class data, and we can't call it, unfortunately, just a class, because that's a reserved term for JavaScript. So let's call this something else. What are they called in games? Sometimes they're called jobs. Sometimes obviously they're called classes. Sometimes they're called professions. Let's call it profession. And we'll say, instead of let profession, we'll say class profession. And actually in JavaScript, it's a convention to capitalize the first letter of a class so that it kind of distinguishes it from objects and other things in your code that are in camel case. And the way that we declare a class, well, we can say class profession, delete the equal sign, and just have the curly braces after it. Or you could say let profession equals class, and then curly braces like this. And then within it, we could say constructor, and then name, comma, HP, comma, magical. Next are our curly braces. And we could say, ooh, that didn't look too good. We could say name, HP, and magical. And name, this dot name should be name. This dot HP should equal HP. And this dot magical should equal magical. Holy smokes, what does any of that mean? Pretty much. So the let's return to the concept of a class. A class is you can think of it as a factory that churns out different objects based on the things that we provide to it as arguments. The way that we declare a class is in this way. We can say let profession equal class, or just class profession capitalized, and then the curly braces after it. So that's how we say we want to have a class that is like a parent of these different objects. Within that class, we need a constructor. This is the work that's the construction worker, or the builder that's going to build our object for us. And that for that constructor, we need to provide it from elsewhere. What are the parameters of the object that we want for it to use to build our object? So in our case, we want to build objects that have names, they have hit points, and they have magical attributes to them. And when we pass in these names, hit points, and magical, we're going to say that the object's name should be equal to the name that we've passed into this this class as an argument. Its HP should be the HP that we've supplied it, and the magical attribute, whether it's true or false, should be equal to the magical argument that's passed into it. So when we say this, which is a whole different conceptual framework that we'll have to deal with when we begin our programming, when we continue our programming journey, but within either web or game design paradigms. When we say this, we're saying it's this object that is being created right now, not some other object that is out there. We want to apply the name to this object that is being created through this class constructor. We'll deal with this at another time. If you want to, add it to your research to look up this in JavaScript, there are some helpful tutorials out there that will explain what it means more fully than we're doing right now. But we will get to it in time, and it's an important concept for us to work on. One way that you can think about it is that in our particular use case scenario, that we have a factory that's going to churn out a wizard class and a rogue class and a fighter class for us. And when we're saying this, it's going to churn out objects for us. And when we say this, I mean this very fighter object that you've created for me. I want it to have a name and hit point and a magical Boolean, true or false, that is dependent upon whatever I provide when I'm declaring that object. When we have that, I haven't really done much with that just yet. And we're going to say, below this, we're going to say, let fighter equal new profession. And in parentheses, Visual Studio helpfully lets me know what is required here, what parameters or arguments are required here. And I can say fighter, comma, 20 hit points, and it is not a magical character class or profession. Let rogue equal new profession, and its name is rogue. It has 15 hit points and it is not magical. And let wizard equal new profession, wizard, comma, 10 hit points, and it is magical. And then console.log fighter, console.log rogue, console.log wizard. Run my code, and I see I've got 3 professions here. One is a fighter with the requisite hit points and whether or not it's magical. I see a rogue and I see a wizard. That's great. So I've used this profession class to construct 3 different professions without having to rewrite this code over and over again. In fact, I could say wizard.spell equal function. Whoops. Console.log fireball. So I've just added to my my wizard object, which is different from now different from each of the other objects in that I've added a new key value pair, and the key is called spell, and the value is called is actually a function, not any of the other data types. And so I'm going to log to the console each of these three objects, and then finally I'm going to run the wizard.spell function. Remember, I need to have the parentheses after the wizard.spell reference so that it knows that I'm calling a function. Save it, run my code, and I see three different objects. I see the profession fighter, rogue, and wizard, and then the wizard has an extra key value pair, which is spell and followed by my function. Then I run the wizard spell, and I get a fireball, which is great. That's awesome. So the wizard truly does have magical ability, whereas the other two professions don't. So I'm sure that you can think of thousands, if not millions, of ways of using this functionality in your games if you have skills that are associated with each of your classes. Maybe your rogue is good at stealth, whereas your fighter is good at fighting, or you have different representations that aren't role-playing game related. That could be like a card game that you want to have key value pairs for each card because they have different functionality when they appear on screen, or you have a tabletop game like a board game that you need to keep track of different tokens and so on and so forth. So objects and arrays as data types are super powerful in JavaScript, and we'll be using them and manipulating them in making our games as well as making our websites for our games. So I think that's a really good segue into saying that from now on, we're going to split off into two different tracks. In one of them, we're going to be using a game development game engine or a framework called Phaser, which is a free-to-use open source JavaScript game engine that I like to use. And we'll be pursuing how to actually visualize and make tabletop games using that framework based on the knowledge that we already have. In the other track, we're going to be using a JavaScript framework called Vue.js, which is a front-end framework for doing web development. Because of the web development aspect, we also need to become comfortable with a little bit of back-end development in terms of spinning up a server and doing that sort of thing. For that, we'll be using a framework called Express.js. And all of these processes will help us get comfortable with the JavaScript ecosystem in general and how to spin up our own games, and both in terms of using the back end and the front end. One thing that I would recommend is that if you're interested in just making the games aspect of it, you might also want to check the web development aspect as well, because we'll be covering some of the basics when it comes to the web aspect of it, because all of the games that we're going to make are going to be playable through a web browser, but we won't discuss like very much in depth how the back end of the making the game works from a web development standpoint in our game series. So it still would be of use to you, even if you're not interested in like HTML and CSS and general back-end development. It still will be of use for you to watch and follow along with the web series so that you know how things are working behind the scenes, even if you're just interested on rendering cards or game tokens or other things in your tabletop game within your game framework. Similarly, if you're just interested in doing web development, we'll go through all kinds of stuff like how to create a server, how to deploy a backend, how to serve up static images, as well as work with a database. And then on the front end side of it, we'll be working on how to use HTML, CSS, and obviously Vue and JavaScript to add interactivity to our websites, whether you want to make like a character generator for your game or just a pretty website that has cool things that are interactive and like single page applications, if you know what that is. We'll do all of that in our web series, but it might be also helpful to check out the game series so that you know how to digitize some of the aspects of your game if that's something that's going to be useful for you in the long run. Cool. So stay tuned for those videos, and we'll see you soon in them. I hope this video has been helpful for you in learning about arrays and objects and classes in JavaScript. If it has, please be sure to like it and subscribe to my channel for more. And I'd love for your help in spreading the word about my books and games. You can check them out at entermancy.com or nightpathpub.com/entermancy, and we'll see you soon.